When a being from beyond the stars steps into the galaxy, the Force itself recoils in confusion. On Exegol, where the Sith eternal worship shadows and silence, something ancient has awakened, something that does not bleed when cut, does not fall when struck, and knows secrets older than the Republic itself. The dark side recognizes power, but this is different, colder, hungrier, a magic that treats life and death as tools to be sorted and catalogued. The Sith send their deadliest warrior to confront the intruder, a Twi'lek marked by pain and crowned in fury, but she will discover that some enemies cannot be fought with lightsabers alone. When a lich god who collects galaxies like trophies meets a disciple willing to burn herself to ash for victory, who decides what power truly means? The red storms of Exegol had churned for 10,000 years, unwitnessed and unceasing, a tempest of blood-colored lightning that lashed the bones of dead star destroyers and the obsidian pylons of forgotten temples. This was a world where the dark side festered like an infected wound, where the veil between life and death had worn so thin that even the Force itself seemed to recoil from what dwelt beneath. The Sith Eternal tended their blasphemous work in silence, cloning flesh and inscribing runes older than the Republic, waiting for a master who would never return. They prayed to shadows and fed their rituals with blood drawn from their own veins, believing that suffering was the language the dark side understood best. They were wrong. Suffering was merely the dialect. The true language was secrets, and on this night, a god who spoke it fluently tore his way into their galaxy. The rupture manifested in the deepest vault, a chamber carved from volcanic glass and lined with thousands of Sith holocrons, each one a prison of malice and memory. The air split like rotten fabric, and through the wound stepped a figure wrapped in tattered robes that seemed stitched from midnight itself. His left hand was skeletal, bleached bone wrapped in necrotic energy that pulsed with sickly green light. His right eye was missing, replaced by a void that drank in illumination and gave back nothing. This was Vecna, the Whispered One, the Undying King, the Lich God of Secrets, and he had crossed the threshold between dimensions not by accident but by design. Somewhere in his endless archives he had glimpsed a vision of this place, a galaxy bound by an energy called the Force, and he had come to claim it, to dissect it, to add its mysteries to his hoard. The Sith acolytes found him 3 hours later, drawn by the sudden silence of the holocrons. They descended into the vault with crimson blades ignited, expecting intruders or malfunctioning droids, but instead they found a scene from a nightmare painted in flesh. 17 of their brothers and sisters lay arranged in a perfect circle, their bodies desiccated, their eyes wide and empty. At the center stood the stranger, one hand raised, fingers curled as if manipulating invisible strings. The holocrons around him were no longer dark. They blazed with that same sickly green, their geometric facets crawling with runes that had not been there before, symbols that hurt to look at, that seemed to writhe and whisper in a language older than Sith or Jedi. When Vecna turned his gaze upon them, the acolytes felt their thoughts laid bare, their secrets pulled from the recesses of memory like organs from a body. 3 collapsed immediately, blood streaming from their noses. The others fled, screaming warnings that would not be believed until it was far too late. Word reached Darth Talon on Korriban, where she had been overseeing the excavation of a tomb that predated even Marka Ragnos. She was a pure-blood Twi'lek, her crimson skin marked with intricate Sith tattoos that coiled around her leku and down her spine, each one a testament to power earned through pain and mastery. Her double-bladed lightsaber hung at her hip, its kyber crystals bled through ritual torment, and her connection to the dark side ran so deep that even hardened Sith lords gave her wide berth. She read the fragmentary report with narrowed eyes, noting the inconsistencies, the terror barely concealed in the syntax. Exegol was meant to be secure, its location a secret even among the Eternal, yet something had breached it, killed with methods that read like neither lightsaber nor force lightning. The descriptions spoke of desiccation, of minds shattered from within, of magic that tasted wrong even to those who wielded the dark side daily. She departed within the hour, her Fury-class interceptor tearing through hyperspace, with coordinates locked to the hidden pathways that led to Exegol. The journey took 2 days, and she spent them in meditation, reaching out through the Force to taste what awaited. What returned was confusion, a signal bent and refracted as if passing through a corrupted lens. The dark side of Exegol had always been potent, a well of power so deep it could drown a lesser practitioner, but now it tasted different. There was a new thread woven through it, something that felt simultaneously ancient and utterly alien, a presence that reminded her of necromancy but operated on principles the Sith had never codified. By the time she emerged from hyperspace above the storm-racked world, her instincts were screaming warnings in a language without words. The approach was treacherous even by Exegol's standards. Lightning, the color of old blood, hammered against her shields, and twice she had to correct her descent to avoid massive floating chunks of wreckage that had been pulled into some kind of slow-motion orbit. The Eternal's beacon guided her to a landing platform carved into the side of a mountain-sized monolith where a delegation of 3 robed figures awaited. They moved stiffly, their gestures mechanical, and when Talon descended the ramp with her hand resting on her saber, she saw why. Their eyes were filmed over with milky white, and their skin had taken on a grey, waxy quality. They were dead, or close enough that the distinction ceased to matter. Yet they moved, spoke, their voices layered with an echo that made her teeth ache. They welcomed her in the formal cadences of Sith protocol, but the words were hollow, puppeted, and when she reached out through the Force to sense their presence, she found only absence, a void shaped like living beings. She cut them down without hesitation, her crimson blades singing through dead flesh and corrupted circuitry. They did not bleed red. They bled black ichor that hissed on contact with the stone, and as they collapsed, their bodies began to dissolve into ash and necrotic mist. Talon stood in the center of the dissipating cloud, her senses straining, and felt the gaze of something vast and patient settle upon her from somewhere deeper in the structure. It was not the Force that carried it. It was older, colder, a scrutiny that peeled back layers and examined what lay beneath. She ignited both blades fully and advanced into the temple, her boots echoing on obsidian floors inscribed with glyphs that now shifted between Sith script and those alien, writhing symbols. The corridors were lined with the dead. Some were Sith eternal, recognizable by their robes and ritual scars. Others were things she had no name for. Flesh sculpted into new and terrible configurations, limbs fused with bone, faces frozen in expressions of ecstasy or terror or both. They did not attack. They simply watched, eyeless sockets tracking her progress, and she understood with sudden clarity that this was not random slaughter. This was experimentation, the methodical dissection of how this galaxy's inhabitants responded to invasive magic. Each corpse was a data point, each mutation a hypothesis tested and recorded. The Sith prided themselves on cruelty, on pushing the boundaries of suffering to achieve power, but this was something else. This was curiosity without conscience, the clinical fascination of a god who viewed life and death as interchangeable resources. She found him in the holocron vault, surrounded by the stolen memories of 10,000 Sith lords. Vecna stood with his back to her, one skeletal hand pressed against a holocron that pulsed in time with his heartbeat, if he still had such a thing. The green light illuminated his form in sickly detail, casting shadows that moved independently of their source. He was reading the holocron, she realized, not through the careful mental interfaces the Sith had designed, but by brute force, tearing the information directly from the crystalline lattice and absorbing it whole. Around him, other holocrons floated in concentric rings, feeding him histories and techniques, and forbidden lore at a rate that should have driven any mind to madness. Yet he stood untroubled, his one good eye scanning invisible texts, his lipless mouth moving in silent recitation. Talon did not announce herself. She simply attacked, launching herself across the chamber with force-enhanced speed, her blades aimed for the junction between skull and spine. She was fast, faster than most beings in the galaxy could track, but Vecna moved with the confidence of something that had fought gods and survived. He turned, one hand rising, and spoke a single word in a language that predated the Force itself. The air between them solidified into a wall of pure force, and Talon's blades skittered across it, throwing sparks and distorted light. The impact sent her skidding backward, her boots carving furrows in the obsidian, and she felt something fundamental shift in the space around her. The Force was still there, still responsive to her will, but it was muted, filtered, as if she were trying to breathe through layers of wet cloth. "A warrior," Vecna said, his voice layered with harmonic distortion, each syllable overlapping itself in a chorus of whispers. "How predictable. Tell me, child of the dark, do you serve strength, or does strength serve you?" Talon did not answer with words. She reached out through the Force and seized the floating holocrons, hurling them at Vecna in a barrage of sharp-edged projectiles. He waved his skeletal hand dismissively, and the holocrons halted in midair, frozen as if time itself had paused. Then he clenched his fist, and they shattered, releasing screams that were not sound but pure psychic agony, the death cries of ancient Sith lords forced to relive their final moments. Talon staggered, her mental shields barely holding against the onslaught, and Vecna advanced, his robes trailing behind him like smoke. "Your power flows from passion," he continued, his tone almost conversational, as if they were discussing philosophy over tea rather than circling for lethal advantage. "Anger, hatred, fear, crude fuels, but effective in their way. Yet you do not understand what you wield. You call it the Force, this energy that binds your galaxy, but it is merely one expression of a much larger truth. Magic, the Force, psychic energy, they are all threads in the same tapestry, and I have spent millennia learning to weave them." Talon responded by channeling the dark side directly, pulling on the well of malice that saturated Exegol and shaping it into a lance of pure entropy. She hurled it forward, and the air between them ignited with black fire, a flame that consumed light itself. Vecna raised his skeletal hand, and the fire struck an invisible barrier, spreading across its surface like oil on water. For a moment, the two energies contested, dark side versus necrotic magic, and the chamber shuddered with the strain. Then Vecna spoke another word, a syllable that tasted of graves and forgotten libraries, and the fire inverted, collapsing back into itself, and then detonating outward in a shockwave that sent Talon crashing into the far wall. She hit hard, her ribs cracking, blood filling her mouth with the taste of copper and failure. Her vision swam, but she forced herself upright, calling on pain to fuel her rage, on rage to sharpen her focus. This was the Sith way, to transmute suffering into strength, and she had been taught by masters who valued nothing less than perfection. She could feel the dark side responding, coiling around her like a serpent, whispering promises of power if only she would let go, if only she would surrender to the totality of her hatred. She reached for it, deeper than she ever had before, and felt something else reach back. Vecna was suddenly beside her, though she had not seen him move. His skeletal hand closed around her throat, lifting her from the ground with strength that defied his withered frame. His one eye stared into hers, and she felt her mind pried open, her memories rifled through like pages in a book. He saw her training under Darth Krayt, the agony of her tattooing, the pride she took in her mastery of Jar Kai. He saw her ambitions, her dreams of ascending beyond mere apprentice to claim power that would make her name whispered across the galaxy. And he saw her fear, buried deep but undeniable, the terror that she would never be enough, that all her strength and skill would prove meaningless against true divinity. "There," he whispered, and his voice was almost gentle, almost kind. "There is the secret you hide even from yourself. You fear obsolescence. You fear that the dark side, for all its promises, will one day cast you aside for a stronger vessel. Let me show you something, child. Let me show you what it means to transcend such mortal concerns." He released her, and Talon collapsed to her knees, gasping. The chamber around them began to shift, reality peeling back to reveal something beneath. She saw visions layered atop visions, possible futures branching like a tree struck by lightning. In one, she served Vecna, her body augmented with necrotic magic, her lightsaber replaced by implements of torture that fed directly into his hoard of secrets. In another, she opposed him and was destroyed, her essence shredded and woven into the fabric of his spells. In a third, she stood beside him as an equal, a lich queen ruling over a galaxy transformed into an endless necropolis where death had been abolished and all served the undying king. Talon spat blood and rose to her feet, her blades reigniting with a sound like tearing silk. "I serve no one," she said, her voice raw but steady. "I am Sith. We take power, we do not beg for it." Vecna tilted his head, a gesture that might have been approval or amusement. "Then take it," he said, and gestured to the shattered holocrons. "Prove your worth. Show me that your philosophy is more than empty words." She attacked again, but this time with strategy rather than fury. She feinted high, then swept low, her blades carving through the space where his legs should have been. But Vecna was no longer entirely physical. His lower half dissolved into mist, reforming behind her, and his skeletal hand lashed out with fingers extended like talons. She spun, deflecting with one blade while the other sought his ribs, but the impact jarred her arms, striking something far more solid than flesh should be. He was protected, she realized, by layers of magical wards that absorbed kinetic energy and converted it into fuel for his spells. Every strike she landed made him stronger. She changed tactics, channeling the force not into direct attacks, but into manipulation of the environment. The obsidian floor cracked and heaved, shards of volcanic glass erupting upward to impale Vecna from below. He spoke a word, and the glass melted, running like water, and then froze again into a cage that sought to trap her instead. She leaped clear, twisting in midair, and hurled her lightsaber like a spear. It spun end over end, trailing crimson light, and Vecna caught it with his skeletal hand. The blade bit into his palm, searing through bone, and for the first time she saw him react. Not with pain, but with interest. "Fascinating," he murmured, examining the way the plasma interacted with his necrotic aura. "A blade of pure energy, stabilized by crystalline resonance. Your people have achieved a remarkable synthesis of magic and technology, though you do not recognize it as such." Talon called the saber back to her hand through the force, but Vecna did not resist. He simply released it, and she felt a wrongness in the weapon, a taint that had not been there before. The Kyber crystal was screaming, its song distorted, and she understood that he had corrupted it in the span of seconds, introducing a fragment of his own essence into its structure. If she continued to wield it, that fragment would grow, spreading through her connection to the blade and eventually into her mind. She deactivated it and let it fall, drawing instead on the raw power of the dark side, shaping it into a blade of pure malevolent energy that extended from her fist. They clashed again, her force blade against his necrotic talons, and the chamber erupted with competing energies. Where her strikes landed, they left burns that glowed with dark side corruption. Where his touched, flesh withered and bone turned brittle. They moved through the vault in a deadly dance, destroying holocrons and scattering ancient texts, and all the while Vecna spoke, his voice weaving between incantations and observations, treating the battle as much an academic exercise as a fight for survival. "You draw power from emotion," he said, parrying a strike that would have taken his head. "But emotion is fleeting, unreliable. I draw power from knowledge, from secrets extracted and hoarded. Every spell I cast is built upon 10,000 years of study. Every gesture encodes libraries. You fight with passion, I fight with certainty." Talon snarled and unleashed a wave of force lightning, the purest expression of Sith hatred given form. It arced across the space between them, branching and crackling, seeking his heart. Vecna raised his skeletal hand, and the lightning struck it, channeling through his bones, and he absorbed it, converted it, twisted it into something new. When he returned the attack, the lightning was green, cold, carrying not heat but entropy, and where it touched her, it aged flesh, turned skin brittle and gray. She screamed, a sound of pure defiance, and met his gaze with eyes that burned like distant suns. "Then witness my certainty," she said, and opened herself fully to the dark side, letting it pour through her without restraint or filter. The effect was immediate and catastrophic. The dark side of Exegol was a reservoir of malice accumulated over millennia, and she had just torn open the floodgates. Power surged through her, rewriting her cellular structure, pushing her body beyond its natural limits. Her tattoos began to glow, first red, then white-hot, and the air around her shimmered with barely contained energy. She became a conduit, a living weapon. And when she struck again, the force of it shattered the floor beneath them, opening a chasm that led down into the planet's molten heart. They fell together into darkness, into heat that would have incinerated any unprotected being, and continued fighting. Talon's body was held together by the force alone now, her muscles tearing and reknitting with every movement, her bones wrapped in telekinetic reinforcement. Vecna floated, unaffected by gravity, his robes untouched by the flames that roared around them. He gestured, and the magma shaped itself into hands that reached for Talon, each one burning with temperatures that rivaled stars. She cut through them with force blades, boiling stone, hissing as it parted, and launched herself at him again and again, a meteor of flesh and fury. But she was dying. She could feel it, the slow dissolution as her body consumed itself to fuel her power. The dark side promised endless strength, but it was a liar, a seducer that demanded payment in blood and years. She had perhaps minutes before her heart gave out, before her mind burned away under the strain, and Vecna knew it. She could see it in his eye, the cold calculation, the certainty that he merely had to wait for her to destroy herself. It enraged her beyond words, beyond thought, and she reached for something deeper still, something that existed at the very foundation of the dark side, the primal scream of entropy that wanted only to unmake, to return all things to void. She found it, and it found her, and for one perfect moment she was not Darth Talon but the avatar of annihilation itself. She spoke no words, shaped no spell, simply released that force in a sphere of absolute negation. Everything within 10 meters ceased to exist, matter and energy deleted from reality, and Vecna was caught at the edge. She saw his wards shatter, saw necrotic magic boil away, saw his physical form begin to unravel, his skeletal hand disintegrated, bone turning to ash, and his robes burned away to reveal the withered corpse beneath, held together by will and ancient curses. But he did not die. Even as his body failed, his consciousness remained, a malevolent intelligence that existed beyond flesh. He reached out not with hands but with pure thought, his mind a weapon honed over ages, and struck directly at Talon's soul. She felt him there, in the deepest core of her being, pulling at the threads that made her who she was. He tried to take her memories, her identity, to add them to his hoard and leave behind only an empty shell. But the dark side roared in defense, recognizing a threat to its vessel, and the two forces met in a contest that had nothing to do with physical space. In that moment, falling through fire with her body coming apart and her mind under siege, Talon understood something fundamental. The dark side was not a tool to be wielded. It was a living current, an expression of the galaxy's shadow, and it had its own will, its own hunger. It had chosen her not because she was strong, but because she was willing to be consumed. And Vecna, for all his power, for all his accumulated secrets, did not understand that. He treated magic as a science, a set of rules to be mastered and exploited. He had never surrendered to anything, never given himself over to forces beyond his control. That was his weakness, the one secret he could never hoard because it required the annihilation of self. She let go. She stopped fighting the dark side, stopped trying to control it, and simply became a channel for its will. The effect was transformative. Her body stabilized, held together not by her effort, but by the force's need for a weapon. Her mind cleared, thoughts sharpening into perfect focus, and when she struck at Vecna again, It was not with her power, but with the accumulated malice of every Sith Lord who had ever bled a kyber crystal, every dark side practitioner who had ever bent the Force to their will. She became a conduit for their collective hunger, and that tide of shadow crashed over Vecna like a tsunami. He was driven back, his consciousness reeling, his carefully constructed mental architecture cracking under the assault. For the first time in millennia, Vecna felt something close to fear. This was not an opponent he could dissect and understand. This was chaos given purpose, entropy with teeth, and it wanted not to defeat him but to erase him, to ensure that not even his secrets remained. He tried to retreat, to pull his essence back into the prepared phylacteries he had hidden across the galaxy. But Talon followed, her spirit hounding his through passages of thought and nightmare, burning away the bridges he had built to immortality. They reached one of his sanctums, a pocket dimension he had carved from the raw stuff of reality and filled with the treasures of 1,000 worlds. Here were spellbooks bound in human skin, artifacts of such potency they warped space around them, and at the center, a crystalline phylactery that housed a fragment of his soul. Talon's spiritual form crashed into it like a comet, and the phylactery shattered, releasing a scream that echoed across dimensional boundaries. Vecna howled, a sound of pure rage and disbelief, and tried to marshal his remaining strength for a counterattack. But Talon was already moving to the next sanctuary, and the next, each one falling before the onslaught of dark side fury. In the physical world, their bodies had crashed to the floor of some deep chamber, lying motionless while their spirits waged war across planes of existence. The Sith Eternal who had survived found them there, two figures locked in stillness, surrounded by an aura of such malevolence that even to approach was to risk madness. They could only watch as the battle raged invisibly, as reality itself bent and flexed around the combatants, as holocrons throughout Exegol began to crack and bleed black ichor. The war of souls continued for hours, then days, time losing meaning in the spaces between spaces where they fought. Vecna was ancient, cunning, and ruthless, but Talon had something he lacked. She had nothing to lose. She had already given herself to the dark side, already accepted that she was a weapon to be used and discarded. That acceptance was a kind of power, a freedom that Vecna, with all his hoarded immortality, could never achieve. Every sanctuary she destroyed, every phylactery she shattered, was another chain broken, another secret torn from his grasp. Finally, with only one phylactery remaining, hidden in a pocket dimension shaped like a library that extended infinitely in all directions, Talon cornered him. Vecna stood among his books, his journals, his accumulated knowledge of 10,000 worlds, and faced the avatar of annihilation that wore a Twi'lek's face. His form was translucent now, barely holding coherence, and his voice was a whisper threading through the silence. "You cannot destroy me," he said, and there was desperation beneath the arrogance. "I am eternal. I am the culmination of ages of study. My knowledge must not be lost." Talon, her spiritual form burning like a dark star, advanced without mercy. "Knowledge without wisdom is poison," she said, her voice layered with the echoes of every Sith who had spoken through her. "Secrets without purpose are chains. You have hoarded and never shared, learned and never taught. You are a monument to sterility, and the Force demands growth, change, the eternal cycle of death and rebirth. You will be unmade, and from your ashes, something new will rise." She reached for the final phylactery, a book bound in scales that had once belonged to something divine, and Vecna lunged, his remaining power coalescing into a final, desperate gambit. He tried to possess her, to leap from his failing vessel into her body, to take control and continue his existence in a new form. For a heartbeat, it seemed to work. His consciousness poured into her, a flood of memories and malice and terrible knowledge, and Talon's form convulsed under the strain. But the dark side was waiting. It had been waiting from the moment she opened herself, patient and hungry. And when Vecna entered, it closed around him like a fist. Talon felt his presence inside her, felt him trying to assert control, and she simply held on, enduring, while the Force fed. It consumed him, not quickly, but thoroughly, breaking down his consciousness into component parts, absorbing his secrets and his spells and his accumulated experience, and distributing them back into the cosmic flow. Vecna screamed, a sound that would echo in Force-sensitive nightmares for generations, and then he was gone, not destroyed but dissolved, returned to the raw potential from which all power springs. Talon opened her eyes to find herself back in her body, lying on cold stone in the depths of Exegol. She was alone. The chamber was empty save for the shattered remains of Vecna's phylactery, which had manifested physically as his essence was torn apart. She rose slowly, her body aching in ways that would take weeks to heal, and felt the dark side settling back into its natural rhythms, satisfied for now. But something had changed. The knowledge Vecna had carried, the spells and techniques he had mastered, they had not vanished with him. They remained, woven into the Force itself, accessible to those with the will and wisdom to find them. She climbed back to the surface over the course of 3 days, navigating through corridors filled with the dead. The Sith Eternal who remained gave her a wide berth, sensing something in her that had not been there before, a depth of power and knowledge that transcended mere mastery of the dark side. When she finally reached her ship and looked back at the storm-racked world, she understood that this had been a test, not of strength but of philosophy. Vecna had represented the ultimate expression of power as hoarding, knowledge locked away and guarded jealously. The Sith, for all their cruelty, at least passed on their teachings, ensured that power flowed from master to apprentice. The victory had not been hers alone but the dark side's, the Force reasserting its fundamental nature against an invader who sought to treat it as just another resource to exploit. She set course for Korriban, her mind already turning to the implications. Vecna's incursion had proven that the boundaries between realities were not absolute, that threats could emerge from beyond the known galaxy. More concerning, his magic had worked here, had interacted with the Force in ways that suggested commonalities between dimensional systems. If one such being could cross over, others might follow. The Sith would need to prepare, to study, to ensure they were not caught unprepared again. And she would lead that effort, carrying within her the echoes of a Lich God's accumulated secrets, a library of forbidden knowledge waiting to be decoded. As her ship entered hyperspace, Talon allowed herself a moment of reflection. She had come closer to death than ever before, had walked the knife's edge between power and annihilation, and emerged changed. The tattoos on her skin had taken on new patterns, echoing the symbols she had seen in Vecna's sanctums, and when she reached out through the Force, she could feel new pathways, new possibilities. She had not just defeated an enemy, she had consumed him, integrated his power into the dark side's endless hunger, and become something more than she had been. The galaxy continued to turn, unaware of how close it had come to a different kind of conquest, one measured not in systems claimed but in secrets stolen, in the slow transformation of reality itself into a necromantic empire. But the Force had its defenders, even among those who served its shadow, and it had proven once again that it could not be so easily supplanted. The dark side was not a tool or a resource. It was a living current, and it demanded participation, surrender, the willingness to be transformed in the pursuit of power. Talon understood that now, in a way she never had before. The Sith Code spoke of breaking chains, of claiming power through passion and victory. But true power required sacrifice, the offering of self to something greater. Vecna had never grasped that truth, had remained always the observer, the collector, the mind that stood apart. And so he had fallen, not to superior force but to a deeper philosophy, one written in the fundamental architecture of this galaxy. In the weeks that followed, reports began to filter in from across the galaxy. Force sensitives spoke of nightmares, of visions of a skeletal hand reaching from darkness, of libraries that burned with green fire. Jedi masters meditated on disturbances in the Force, ripples that suggested something vast had moved through the cosmic flow and been digested. But these were distant echoes, aftershocks of a battle fought beyond the reach of most. The true conflict had occurred in spaces between, in the war of philosophies and the contest of wills, and only one being in the galaxy knew the full scope of what had transpired. Darth Talon kept that knowledge close, adding it to her own hoard of secrets. She trained harder, delved deeper into Sith lore, and began to experiment with techniques that blended the dark side with the magical principles she had absorbed from Vecna's dissolution. Some worked, producing effects that had not been seen since the ancient Sith practiced alchemy and sorcery as routinely as lightsaber combat. Others failed catastrophically, teaching her the limits of her new understanding. But she persisted, driven by the certainty that this was merely the beginning, that Vecna's arrival was a harbinger of things to come. On Exegol, the Sith Eternal worked to restore their sanctums, to repair the damage done by forces they barely understood. They found Vecna's remaining thralls, the reanimated corpses that had once served him, and put them to final rest with fire and falls, purification rituals. They sealed the deepest vaults, the ones where reality had grown thin, and posted guards with instructions to kill anything that emerged. But they could not undo what had been done. The holocrons that Vecna had touched remained corrupted, their contents twisted into hybrid knowledge that blended Sith teaching with necrotic theory. Some were destroyed. Others were kept, studied in secret by those brave or foolish enough to risk contamination. And in the deepest vault, where Vecna had first arrived, the tear in reality had not fully healed. It was small, barely visible, a shimmer in the air that most would miss. But it remained, a scar in the fabric of space, and through it occasionally drifted whispers, fragments of thought from dimensions beyond counting. The Sith who guarded it reported hearing voices, speaking in languages that predated sound itself, offering knowledge, promising power, asking only for the smallest of favors in return. Most resisted, some did not. And so the seeds were planted for future conflicts, for new incursions and hybrid philosophies, for the slow bleeding together of realities that had been meant to remain separate. Talon knew about the tear. She had felt it during her battle, had sensed it as the point of origin for Vecna's arrival. Part of her wanted to return, to seal it properly, to ensure that no others could follow the same path. But another part, the part that had drunk deep from the well of forbidden knowledge, was curious. What else lay beyond that threshold? What other forms did power take in dimensions where the Force was unknown? The questions haunted her, pulling at her thoughts during meditation, whispering possibilities in her dreams. She would return eventually, she knew. Not immediately, not until she had fully mastered what she had already gained. But the call was there, the temptation to step through and see what lay on the other side, to add those secrets to her own collection. In that sense, Vecna's influence persisted, not as a distinct entity, but as a pattern of thought, a mode of approaching power that emphasized acquisition and understanding above all else. The Sith had always walked the edge of such thinking, but Talon felt it more acutely now, the hunger to know, to possess, to control not just through strength but through comprehension. The galaxy turned through its cycles, empires rising and falling, the eternal conflict between light and dark playing out on 1,000 worlds. The Jedi sensed disturbances, shadows moving in the Force, but they attributed it to the usual machinations of the Sith and turned their attention to more immediate threats. They did not know, could not know, that the fundamental rules had shifted slightly, that the membrane separating their reality from others had been weakened, that forces which had once been safely distant were now tantalizingly close. In the years that came, there would be other incursions, other beings slipping through, cracks in space, but they would find a galaxy more prepared, if not fully understanding. The knowledge that realities could bleed together, that power took forms beyond Kyber and the Force, had been planted. Some would seek to exploit it, to open portals and make pacts with entities that existed in conceptual space. Others would work to seal the breaches, to maintain the integrity of their dimension against external corruption. The conflict would shape a new generation of Force users, ones who blended Jedi discipline, Sith passion, and magical theory from beyond the stars. But that was the future, unwritten and uncertain. In the present, Darth Talon sat in meditation aboard her ship, her mind drifting through the new pathways that had opened within her. She could feel Vecna's echo, not as a presence but as a texture in her thoughts, a way of passing problems and seeking solutions. She had consumed a god, however diminished, and been marked by the experience. Whether that mark was blessing or curse remained to be seen. The stars streamed past in the blue-white tunnel of hyperspace, and in their patterns she thought she saw symbols, runes that hurt to comprehend, promises written in light that had never touched a world. She closed her eyes and reached deeper into the Force, seeking guidance, seeking clarity, seeking the certainty that she had made the right choice in opening herself so completely. What returned was ambiguous, a vision of herself standing in a library that extended into infinity, surrounded by books bound in flesh and star metal, each one containing a secret that could reshape galaxies. In the vision, she was not alone. Shadows moved between the shelves, other seekers after knowledge, other beings who had traded everything for understanding. Some were human, or had been once. Others were things without form, intelligence without flesh, consciousnesses that existed as pure pattern and will. And at the center of the library, seated upon a throne carved from a single massive black opal, was a figure she almost recognized. It wore her face, but its eyes were empty sockets, and its hands moved in gestures that shaped reality like clay. The vision ended abruptly, leaving her gasping, her heart racing. She understood its meaning. The path she had set herself upon led toward apotheosis or annihilation, toward becoming something more than Sith or Jedi, or losing herself entirely in the pursuit. There would be no middle ground, no comfortable mastery. She had tasted the fruit of transcendent knowledge, and it had whetted an appetite that could never be fully satisfied. The question was whether she would master that hunger or be mastered by it. Time would tell. For now, she had a galaxy to navigate, enemies to face, and secrets to uncover. The shadow of Vecna had passed, but its echo remained, woven into the very fabric of the Force, waiting for those bold or foolish enough to follow where it led. And Darth Talon, marked and changed, would be first among them, carrying forward the legacy of a conflict that had reshaped the boundaries between possible and impossible, between the known galaxy and the infinite dark beyond. The ship dropped out of hyperspace above Korriban, and Talon opened her eyes. The ancient Sith world spread below, its valleys filled with tombs, and its peaks crowned with temples. This was home, or as close as a Sith ever came to such a concept. This was where she would begin the next phase of her work, decoding the hybrid knowledge she had absorbed, teaching a new generation that power came in forms their ancestors had never imagined. The Sith would evolve, or they would be supplanted by those willing to embrace uncomfortable truths. She descended through the rust-colored atmosphere, her ship cutting through clouds of ancient dust, and felt the dark side rising to meet her. It recognized her now, not just as a practitioner, but as something new, a hybrid of philosophy and practice, someone who had looked beyond the galaxy and brought back treasures and terrors in equal measure. The planet welcomed her, its tombs opening like mouths, hungry to be fed new knowledge, new techniques, new ways of achieving the power the Sith had always craved. As her boots touched the sand of Korriban once more, Darth Talon allowed herself a thin smile. Vecna had come to conquer, to collect, to reduce an entire galaxy to entries in his archive. He had failed, consumed by the very power he sought to catalogue. But his legacy persisted, not as triumph but as catalyst, forcing the Sith to confront uncomfortable questions about the nature of power, knowledge, and the price of immortality. They would have to adapt, to grow, to become something their predecessors might not recognize. And she would lead that transformation, carrying in her mind the library of a lich god, the accumulated secrets of ages beyond counting. The dark side had chosen her for this task, had preserved her through conflicts that should have been fatal, because it recognized that change was necessary, that stagnation was death. Vecna had represented the ultimate stagnation, power that existed only to maintain itself, knowledge hoarded rather than applied. The Sith would not make that mistake. They would take what had been learned, weaponize it, and use it to carve their names across the stars in letters of fire and darkness. The future was unwritten, but its shape was beginning to emerge from the chaos. A galaxy where the boundaries between realities were known to be permeable, where power came not just from Kyber and the Force, but from sources ancient when the Republic was young. A galaxy where the old conflicts between Jedi and Sith would be complicated by new factions, new philosophies, new ways of wielding the fundamental energies that bound existence together. It would be an age of wonders and horrors, of discoveries that elevated and corruptions that destroyed. And at its heart, bearing scars that would never fully damn sight, heal, carrying knowledge that would shape generations, stood Darth Talon, avatar of the dark side's hunger, keeper of a dead god's secrets, and architect of the new Sith order that would rise from the ashes of the old. She looked up at the twin suns of Korriban, feeling their heat on her face, and knew with absolute certainty that the galaxy would never be the same. Vecna's invasion had been repelled, but the door he opened could not be fully closed. What came through next would test them all. The winds of Korriban howled across the Valley of the Dark Lords, carrying whispers of ancient power and future conflicts. Talon walked among the tombs, her presence causing the stone guardians to stir, their eyes flickering with recognition of her transformed state. She had survived the impossible, had taken the measure of a being from beyond reality, and found him wanting. That victory would be her legacy, her gift to the Sith who came after, proof that no power was absolute, that even gods could fall if opposed by sufficient will and understanding. But victories came with prices, lessons written in scars and nightmares. She would carry Vecna's echo always, a splinter of alien thought embedded in her psyche, whispering possibilities that the Sith code had never imagined. Managing that influence, learning from it without being consumed, would be the work of years, perhaps decades. Some nights she would wake screaming, convinced that skeletal hands were reaching for her secrets, that her own mind was turning against her. Those were the costs of her triumph, the toll extracted by forces beyond simple victory or defeat. Yet she did not regret it, could not regret it. She was Sith, and the Sith existed to test limits, to push beyond what others deemed possible. If that meant carrying the ghost of a lich god in her thoughts, if it meant walking forever on the edge of corruption, then so be it. She would master this burden as she had mastered the dark side, through discipline and will, and the absolute refusal to surrender to fear. And in mastering it, she would transcend it, becoming something the galaxy had never seen, a bridge between modes of power that had been thought forever separate. The sun set behind the mountains, casting long shadows across the sand. In those shadows, things stirred, awakened by her passage, drawn to the new resonance she carried. They were not alive, not in any traditional sense, but they were not entirely dead either. They were echoes, impressions left by Sith Lords so powerful that their essence had stained reality itself. They regarded her with something like curiosity, these ghosts of ancient masters, sensing in her a kindred hunger for knowledge and power. Talon did not flee or fight. She stood her ground, letting them approach, letting them examine what she had become. And when they had seen enough, when they understood that she carried within her the seeds of a new philosophy, they withdrew, settling back into their eternal rest. But their approval lingered, a benediction from the dead, permission to pursue her vision wherever it might lead. She had been tested by the past and found worthy. Now she would shape the future, or die trying. The stars emerged overhead, cold and distant, and among them Talon imagined she could see other galaxies, other realities, other modes of existence waiting to be explored or confronted. Vecna had been first, but he would not be last. The door was open now, the veil torn, and in time others would come, drawn by curiosity or conquest or simple accident. When they arrived, they would find a galaxy that had learned from harsh experience, that had adapted and evolved, that knew the value of flexibility in the face of existential threats. And they would find her, Darth Talon, the one who had stared into the abyss of a lich god's ambition and emerged carrying pieces of it within her soul. She would be the galaxy's shield and sword, its warning and its weapon, the living proof that power respected no boundaries save those enforced by superior will. The Jedi would fear her. The Sith would revere her. And beings from beyond would know that this galaxy, for all its conflicts and contradictions, was not defenseless against forces that recognized no law but strength. She turned and walked back toward her ship, her footprints in the sand already being erased by the wind. Behind her, the tombs of Korriban stood silent, holding their dead and their secrets, patient as stone. Ahead lay challenges she could only dimly perceive, conflicts that would test not just her power but her identity, her sanity, her very soul. But she had been forged in crucibles that would have destroyed lesser beings, had walked through fire, physical and metaphysical, and emerged tempered like the finest blade. Whatever came next, she would face it. She was Sith, she was survivor. She was the dark side's chosen vessel for this new age of hybrid power and dimensional conflict. And she would ensure, through whatever means necessary, that when the history of this era was written, it would record that the galaxy had stood firm against the incursion of forces from beyond, that the Force had proven itself resilient enough to absorb and adapt even when confronted by magic that operated on alien principles. The ship's ramp closed behind her, sealing her in with controls and computers and the comfortable hum of technology that had been built by mortal hands according to rules that made sense. But in her mind, other spaces opened, conceptual territories mapped by the knowledge she had consumed, libraries without walls where secrets waited to be discovered. She would explore them, carefully and methodically, extracting what was useful and discarding what was poison. She would become the bridge between this galaxy and the infinite dark beyond, translating alien concepts into forms the Force could metabolize. It was a heavy burden, perhaps too heavy for any single being, but that had never stopped the Sith before. They were the ones who dared where others feared, who reached for power that wiser beings knew to leave untouched. And if that reaching sometimes led to damnation, well, at least it was a glorious damnation. A fall measured in the reshaping of galaxies rather than the quiet fading of those who never tried. Darth Talon sat in the pilot's seat and reached for the controls, her movements automatic, muscle memory freeing her mind to wander through the territories within. The ship lifted on repulsors, rising above the valley of the Dark Lords, and she took one last look at the tombs below. They had stood for millennia, monuments to power that had seemed absolute in its time. Now they were merely history, context for the evolution that must come. She would not build a tomb. She would build a legacy, written in living flesh and burning minds, ensuring that when she finally fell, it would be forward, into depths no one had yet charted. The stars called, and she answered, launching her ship into the night. Behind her, Korriban turned through its ancient orbit, patient and eternal. And somewhere in the spaces between realities, where dimensions brushed against each other like pages in an infinite book, other intelligences felt the ripples of what had occurred. Some were intrigued, others were alarmed. All understood that a threshold had been crossed, that the boundaries they had respected or been confined by were no longer absolute. The age of isolation was ending, the age of convergence was beginning. And at its center, bearing the scars and wisdom of the first contact, sailed Darth Talon, alone but undaunted, carrying forward the dark side's eternal promise that power belonged to those strong enough to claim it, regardless of where that power originated or what price it demanded. She had paid the initial cost in pain and transformation. The galaxy would pay the rest, for good or ill, as the seeds planted this day germinated and grew into forests that would shelter or devour generations yet unborn.